There's a particular charm to the city as it winds down for the evening. Cars honking, pedestrians immersed in their own orbits, while streetlights cast a familiar amber glow. I was waiting beside a food truck, lost in thought, as the vendor handed me my order with a warm, "Here you go." I thanked him, feeling a peculiar sense of excitement. I'd grab some street food, drop by Megan's office, and surprise her. You know, that kind of random gesture that keeps a marriage interesting. After all, isn't that what marriage is supposed to be? Small gestures, unplanned moments, little reminders that you're still there for each other? But I digress. I'm Jake, 36 years old, an IT manager for one of those tech firms that prides itself on disrupting something. I can't complain. The job keeps the lights on, food on the table, and our mortgage paid. Megan and I have been married for 6 years, and we have a little girl, Lily, who just turned 5. On paper, everything looked pretty good. Marriage, career, family, the milestones checked off. So there I was, whistling to myself, holding a greasy paper bag filled with Megan's favorite street food, feeling almost giddy, like a guy on a first date. I even entertained the idea of dragging her out of her stuffy office for a few minutes to enjoy the city view, to just talk, to be us. A throwback to when we were younger and life's biggest problem was who'd pick up the pizza bill. So, I marched into the office lobby, giving a casual nod to the security guard. He stiffened a bit, which struck me as odd. I mean, I'd picked Megan up from work a handful of times. He should recognize me by now. "I'm here to see my wife, Megan," I said, smiling. He nodded, his face strained, and motioned me to head up as he let out a long sigh. "Long day," I joked, trying to break the tension. He nodded without looking at me, and something about his reaction nagged at me. But maybe he was just having a bad day, so I brushed it off. When I reached her office, the door was closed, and from behind it, I could hear muffled voices. I smiled to myself, anticipating her surprise when she saw me. I pushed the door open without knocking, eager to catch her reaction. But what I saw felt like stepping into an ice-cold pool, the kind that shocks you straight into numbness. Megan was there, all right, but she wasn't alone. She was wrapped around someone, her blouse half open, his hands on her waist, her legs folded around his torso like this was a romance movie scene they were filming. And that someone wasn't just anyone. It was Robert. The Robert. Friend of her father, old enough to know better, and the last person I expected to see in this position, literally or otherwise. It was as if time just stopped. Megan froze, her expression snapping from shock to horror. She tried to pull herself together, but her panicked eyes couldn't keep up with her attempts to smooth down her disheveled hair. "Jake," she shrieked, her voice barely breaking the silence. What are you doing here?" I didn't answer. I just stood there, silent, holding the paper bag of street food that now felt ridiculously out of place. All the thoughts I thought I'd have in a moment like this, the yelling, the accusations, the demands for answers, none of them came. Instead, I felt strangely blank, almost numb. It's funny, the tricks your mind plays. Here I was, in the middle of what could be the most shattering moment of my life, and all I could think about was how absurd it all seemed. Megan, of all people, hooking up with Robert? I mean, he's practically ancient. To think I'd been stressing over data breaches and network security risks at work while she was here, conducting her own networking session. I finally found my voice, though it sounded hollow to my own ears. "Guess I came at a bad time." She began sputtering out some mix of apology and excuse, but I barely heard her. I was just watching Robert fumble to button his shirt, his face turning ashen. He looked every bit like a man clinging to life support, and the sight would have almost been funny if it weren't so grotesque. Taking a step back, I looked between them, and finally, my voice turned cold, steadier than I expected. "Robert," I said, my tone as measured as if we were at a family dinner, "I'm not going to punch you right here. Not because you don't deserve it, but because, frankly, I don't want to break a hip." He gulped, looking more like a cornered animal than a friend. Megan's face paled, her mouth hanging open as if she'd finally found herself at a loss for words. Which, for her, was a rare occasion. Turning back to Megan, I added, "And you? We'll meet in court." With that, I walked out of the room, ignoring her as she shouted my name, and leaving Robert to his shirt and his shame. I didn't feel the urge to yell or make a scene. What was the point? Some things don't need dramatic speeches or accusations. The truth, I figured, was loud enough on its own. As I headed out, the security guard watched me, wide-eyed, with an expression that almost bordered on pity. I gave him a quick wave, and he nodded back, understanding that whatever I'd found up there wasn't the kind of thing anyone wanted to walk into. When I got back to my car, I sat there in silence, staring at the dashboard. I felt my hands shake, but no tears came. I was too drained to even muster a single scream. Instead, I took a deep breath, trying to grasp what this meant. This wasn't some temporary glitch in the marriage, something you could patch up with a nice dinner and a couples therapy session. No, this was the end of the story I thought we were writing together. The minutes ticked by as I sat in the car, alone in the parking lot. Eventually, I started the engine, my thoughts racing faster than my speedometer as I drove home, realizing that home wasn't home anymore. The bags we packed for family getaways, the silly holiday decorations Megan insisted on, the photos we'd framed over the years, all of it had just turned into set dressing for a life I no longer believed in. As soon as I got inside, I scribbled a note on the back of a random bill envelope I found on the dresser. It was short. Just enough to let her know I wouldn't be coming back. Then I grabbed a small bag, packed it, and left, barely glancing back at the pieces of my life scattered around the room. Because at that moment, the man who'd built this life had walked out the door, and he wasn't planning on coming back. I barely slept that night. The hotel bed felt more like a stiff reminder than a place of rest, but maybe it was fitting. Between the uncomfortable mattress and the walls that seemed way too thin, I drifted in and out of a haze, going over every moment that led me to Megan's office the night before. The details, the logic, the warning signs I'd missed. Hindsight, as they say, is 20/20. But what good did it do now? By dawn, I was wide awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how I'd start this day. And I knew there was only one person I wanted to talk to about it, Tom. Tom and I had been friends since high school, and he was the one guy I knew would keep his head on straight while I was trying to keep my sanity intact. I shot him a quick text, and within minutes, he replied with, "Of course, man. Come over." As if he knew this was about to be serious. I couldn't bring myself to say much in the text, but he'd get it soon enough. When I got to his place, he had 2 mugs of coffee waiting on the table. Tom took one look at me as I sat down, and his brow furrowed. "What happened?" he asked, sounding almost like he already knew this was bad, just not how bad. I took a deep breath, staring into the mug like it held some magic answer, and then spilled the whole story. I told him about the random gesture, the street food, the look on the guard's face, and then the punchline, Megan and Robert tangled together like a pair of lovesick teenagers. The words tumbled out before I could think about them too much, and I watched as Tom's jaw clenched, his face a mix of shock and anger on my behalf. "Robert?" he asked, incredulous. "Her dad's friend." I laughed bitterly, nodding. "Oh yeah. Robert, the walking advertisement for cholesterol medication." Tom shook his head, speechless for a second before letting out a long whistle. "I mean, damn. I thought you two were solid. You always looked like, I don't know, the picture of happy marriage." That's what I thought too. I took a long sip of coffee, feeling the sting of bitterness settle on my tongue. "But looks like we were both wrong." Tom nodded, trying to keep the shock from twisting his expression. "So why? Did she give you a reason? Or was it just some midlife crisis thing?" I let out a dry laugh, remembering Megan's panicked expression when I'd walked in. The way she'd stammered, trying to pin the blame on me as if I was somehow responsible for her having an affair. Apparently, she thinks I'm the problem. Said I was too focused on work, that I'd pushed her away. The classic clichés, right? Nothing I haven't seen in every bad breakup movie. Tom shook his head in disbelief. "Unbelievable. I mean, it's one thing to have issues, but to go behind your back like that? With him, of all people." I shrugged. "Honestly, I think it's about money. He's loaded. Megan's always liked nice things. Maybe it's her twisted way of keeping up. Or maybe she's just shallow. Either way, it doesn't matter. Cheating is cheating." Tom nodded, his face darkening. "Yeah, man. She made her choice. And now you get to make yours. Whatever you need to do, I've got your back." Hearing that calmed something in me. Sometimes you just need someone in your corner, not spewing advice but just being there. And Tom was that kind of friend. I raised my mug in a half-hearted toast. "Here's to the start of something," I said with a grim smile. Leaving Tom's place, I felt a little steadier, but I still had a mountain to climb. I couldn't let Megan control the narrative, couldn't let her twist the story to make herself the victim. I needed backup. I needed someone who could protect my interests and make sure I didn't end up as the villain in this mess. And that's where Linda came in. Tom had recommended her, saying she was a bulldog in a blazer, just the kind of lawyer I needed on my side. When I stepped into her sterile office, with its glass walls and sleek furniture, she looked up with a sympathetic but professional expression. Maybe she'd had enough clients walk through her door wearing this exact face, with the same dazed look of someone whose life had just been turned upside down. She listened quietly as I laid out the details, her expression sharpening as she took notes. Finally, she put her pen down, nodding. "I'm sorry you're going through this, Jake. Infidelity is devastating, but it sounds like you're doing the right thing. We'll protect your interests and make sure you get custody of Lily." I nodded, feeling a flicker of relief. I want this to be as smooth as possible, for Lily's sake. But I'm not letting Megan walk all over me. Linda nodded in understanding. "We'll proceed with a divorce filing. From what you've told me, there's ample cause for your case to be favorable. And we'll include specific terms to protect your assets and request custody. If we gather strong evidence, it'll be a lot easier to secure that." She explained the process, laying out the legal strategies like a soldier preparing for battle. Hearing her talk, I felt like I had a lifeline. It was enough to keep me grounded, even if the ground felt like it was crumbling beneath me. As I left Linda's office, my phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from Megan. "Jake, we need to talk. Please." I scoffed, shoving the phone back in my pocket. She wanted to talk. Sure, now that the spotlight was on her, she wanted a way out, some easy fix. But I didn't owe her a single word. I kept walking, trying to focus on anything but the mess she'd made of our life. When I got back to the hotel, I was hoping for some peace, maybe a few hours of uninterrupted solitude. But no sooner had I dropped onto the bed than my phone started buzzing again, and this time, she wasn't taking the hint. Text after text, each one dripping with more desperation than the last. She must have hit every note in the cheater's apology songbook, from tearful admissions to sudden rage, as if I was somehow to blame for her own actions. She even threw in a threat or two, like I'd be the one to lose if this went public. By the time she tried calling, I'd had enough. I blocked her number, feeling a dark satisfaction at cutting off her last attempt at control. Let her stew in silence for a while. I was done with her guilt-tripping games. That evening, I sat in a hotel bar, nursing a whiskey, watching the bubbles swirl in the amber liquid as I wondered how many people around me had stories just as messed up, or worse. My world had shattered, but to them, I was just another guy nursing a drink. And honestly, there was something comforting about the anonymity of it. No judgment. No pity. Just the quiet hum of the world continuing, indifferent to the chaos I was trapped in. It was somewhere between the second and third whiskey that I felt something shift. I knew I was facing a long fight ahead, with Megan, the lawyers, the inevitable court drama. But sitting there, I felt a new resolve settle over me. She wasn't going to get the last word. Not Megan, not Robert, and certainly not some ridiculous excuse blaming work and neglect. If Megan wanted a battle, she'd get one, and I'd come prepared. For the next few days, things were mercifully quiet, at least on the Megan front. The hotel walls were starting to feel like home, which says more about my current situation than I'd like to admit. I buried myself in work emails, distractions, anything that kept my mind from straying back to her. She'd finally backed off after the string of blocked calls and unanswered messages, though I didn't kid myself that this was over. Megan wasn't the type to give up easily, not without trying every manipulation she could muster. Then, just as I'd begun to enjoy the silence, a knock came on my hotel door one night. I opened it, expecting room service or maybe the manager asking about my extended stay. Instead, I found Megan standing there, her face blotchy from crying, eyes red and puffy, the whole works. She looked like she'd been waiting for this moment to break down in front of me, a last-ditch effort to sway me with the whole act. And boy, was it an act. "Jake, please," she started, her voice breaking just on cue. "It was a mistake. A terrible mistake. We need to talk. Can't we just fix this?" I held the door open for a moment, then let out a sigh, not out of pity but exhaustion. I gestured for her to come in. I wasn't interested in her apology, but I figured she'd only keep showing up unless I let her say whatever half-baked excuse she'd concocted to justify betraying me. Once inside, she dropped her purse onto the chair, and I could tell she was sizing up the situation, probably noting the bag I'd left by the dresser, ready to be packed at a moment's notice. She looked at me, then looked away, putting on an air of remorse so thick you'd need a knife to cut through it. "You've got 5 minutes," I said, crossing my arms. Her lip quivered, though I could see her eyes shift as if she were calculating her words. "Jake, it wasn't supposed to mean anything," she whispered. "Robert, he was just there, always supporting me, always, making me feel wanted." "Wanted?" I replied, laughing bitterly. "So you thought I was what, just a piece of furniture? A footnote to your midlife crisis? You were my wife, Megan. I trusted you. And you decided that feeling wanted was worth throwing everything away." She blinked, her face wavering between anger and guilt. "Jake, you don't understand," she said, trying to shift the blame. "You were always working, always focused on your job, on providing. But what about me? I needed more than just the paycheck, more than just a provider. More than a provider." I shot back, incredulous. "That's funny because all this time, I thought you were pretty damn happy with what I was providing. The house, the vacations, the stable life we built together. Lily's education. The things you didn't seem to mind when it suited you." Megan's face turned red, anger replacing the sorrow. She reached out as if she could pull me back into her web of justifications, but I took a step back, folding my arms tighter. "Look, Megan," I said, my voice steady, "this isn't about my job or about me working too much. This is about you. Your choices. You don't just trip and fall into someone else's arms by accident, especially when that someone is an old family friend. You made a choice, and it's a choice you're going to live with." Her expression twisted, the tears drying up in an instant. It was like watching her flip a switch, her pity routine morphing into something uglier, colder. "You know what, Jake?" she hissed, venom edging her tone. "You're not so perfect yourself. Maybe if you'd paid more attention to me, instead of just throwing money at everything, we wouldn't be here." I shook my head, almost in disbelief. "You really think that makes any of this okay? You think you can turn this on me because you felt neglected? That somehow, your selfish, reckless choices are my fault?" The silence hung between us, thick and heavy, until she finally looked down, her fists clenching. "Fine," she muttered, finally dropping the facade. "But this isn't over, Jake. Not by a long shot." She stormed out, heels clicking sharply down the hallway as I closed the door behind her, feeling an odd sense of relief. The show was over. I'd seen every possible version of her apology, every attempt to play victim, to blame me. None of it had worked. She'd made her choice, and she wasn't going to twist reality to make me feel responsible for it. But the next day, things took a turn. Work called, and in a brief, cold conversation, I learned that my position will most likely be eliminated. They framed it as restructuring, but I knew this was anything but a coincidence. Megan's vendetta had just started, and she was already playing her cards. After I hung up, I slumped back into the hotel chair, trying to piece it all together. I wasn't naive, she's had connections, and it wouldn't take much for her to spread rumors, drop hints, and make my life complicated. The timing was too convenient. And sure enough, as the day wore on, the blows kept coming. A call from the bank. "Mr. Collier, we noticed your mortgage payment is overdue." My mind went straight to our accounts. Megan had always been the one handling the house finances, as she called them. Now, I was seeing how easily she could manipulate them. That evening, just as I'd stepped into my hotel room, there was another knock. This time, it wasn't Megan. I opened the door to find 2 police officers standing there, expressions stern. One of them handed me a notice, stating that I was under a restraining order on leaving on, requested by Megan for alleged threatening behavior. I looked at them, incredulous, my voice coming out cold. "Is this some kind of joke?" "Sir," one of the officers said, sounding almost apologetic, "we're just delivering the order. This prevents you from making contact with her or approaching the house until a hearing can determine otherwise." I was too stunned to reply. As they walked away, the weight of everything settled on me. Megan wasn't just cutting ties. She was burning the bridge, the river, and anything that might connect me to my old life. She'd pulled the last lever she could find, playing the victim of my supposed threats. Sitting in the silence of my room, I realized I needed help beyond the typical legal avenues. This was no ordinary divorce. It was war. I grabbed my phone and dialed Linda, my lawyer. When she picked up, I laid it all out, telling her about the sudden job loss, the bank's mortgage call, and now the restraining order. I could hear the shock in her voice as I explained it, but she quickly shifted to a reassuring tone. "Jake," she said, "this sounds like a deliberate attempt to control you through intimidation and manipulation. We'll fight this, but I recommend you hire a private investigator. Someone who can gather solid evidence on your behalf, expose any ulterior motives, and make sure we have a strong case." The next morning, I found myself sitting across from Dan, the private investigator Linda had recommended. He was older, in his 50s maybe, with a tired look in his eyes that spoke of seeing every kind of betrayal imaginable. I told him everything, from the affair to the sudden job loss, the mortgage threats, and the restraining order. He listened, taking notes, nodding thoughtfully as I spoke. When I was done, he put down his pen and looked at me squarely. "Jake, this is more common than you think. People who are backed into a corner pull every trick they can to make themselves look like the victim. I'll start my investigation right away, but I'll need access to anything you can give me. Financial records, texts, emails, anything to paint a clear picture." Over the next few days, Dan kept me updated. He was methodical, and the evidence he uncovered started to form a picture. Megan's relationship with Robert was more than a passing fling. They'd been seeing each other for months, meeting up in hotel rooms, exchanging business trip stories to cover their tracks. Worse, they'd mocked me in messages, laughing at how clueless I was, making jokes about the life I thought we were building. Each new piece of evidence felt like another punch to the gut. But as Dan handed me folder after folder of proof, I also felt a strange sense of validation. This wasn't just betrayal. It was premeditated, calculated. Megan had orchestrated every move, all while playing the part of the wronged wife. Now, I had the full story. Finally, Dan looked up at me with a tired smile. "She's built her own prison, Jake. All you have to do is lock the door." As I sat across from Dan, the investigator, his words echoed in my mind. "She's built her own prison, Jake. All you have to do is lock the door." And honestly, it was about time. I'd spent enough nights tossing and turning, feeling my life disintegrate piece by piece, all because of her lies. Megan wanted to play the victim? Fine. I'd let her act out the part she was so desperate to play, but this time, I'd be directing the show. Dan handed over a thick file, filled with damning evidence. Texts, emails, photos, even copy of receipts from those secret business trips that Megan and Robert took together. A few of the messages were vicious enough to make my stomach turn. To think that this was the woman I'd once vowed to love, and the man I'd once considered a family friend. Now they were nothing more than actors in a cheap, sordid soap opera, each message an episode in their trashy drama. The best part? They'd left their fingerprints all over the script. "Linda will know what to do with this," Dan said, sliding the folder across the table with a grim nod. "Her team can use it to build a case that'll sink them both. But there's more we can do if you're interested." I raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "More?" Dan leaned in, his eyes narrowing with a glint of dark satisfaction. "This evidence is enough for a divorce with favorable terms. You get the house, custody of Lily, a clean financial split. But, if you want to hit harder, make it impossible for her to bounce back, we can bring some of this public. There's no shortage of online forums, and the court records are public if you know where to look." I thought about it. Megan had taken everything she could from me, tried to strip me of my dignity, my job, my reputation. Maybe she deserved a taste of her own medicine, just enough for her to feel what she'd put me through. But I hesitated. Revenge felt gratifying in theory, but in reality, there was a child in the mix, Lily. Let's play it by ear, I finally said. I don't want this to haunt Lily when she's older. But if Megan wants to make this messy, I'll be ready. Dan nodded. Fair enough. In the meantime, I'll keep digging, just in case. Let Linda know that I'm here for anything else you might need. Back in Linda's office the next day, I handed over the file, and she opened it, her professional composure never wavering as she flipped through the pages. I watched as her eyes scanned the texts, her face impassive, but the slight tightening of her jaw gave away her disgust. This is comprehensive, she said, finally looking up. It'll be difficult for her to refute any of this. It's more than enough to back your custody claim, and if she tries to demand a settlement, this will prove she acted in bad faith. I nodded, the words almost feeling surreal. In bad faith. Megan had built a cathedral of bad faith and set fire to it. Now, she was about to watch it burn from the inside. Linda looked at me seriously. Jake, this won't be easy. She'll counter with every legal move she can, especially with custody on the line. Are you ready for that? I met her gaze, steady and resolute. I have to be. I'm doing this for Lily. I don't want Megan's instability, her lies, or her relationships affecting our daughter. She deserves better. Linda nodded approvingly, scribbling some notes. Good. Then I'll prepare the initial filing. Megan will be served within a week. Given her current restraining order, she can't legally interfere with you for now, but expect her to escalate when she realizes the extent of your claim. As I left Linda's office, my mind started to work on what this would look like. Megan, served with divorce papers, staring down a legal assault she never saw coming. I didn't feel triumphant exactly, but for the first time, I felt in control. I'd been on the defensive for too long. Now I had the upper hand, and I was done playing the nice guy. True to her word, Linda wasted no time. A week later, I got confirmation that Megan had been served. She tried to call me from a different number, but I blocked it, letting the silence speak louder than any words I could offer. I imagined her reaction, the fury, the shock, the scrambling to figure out her next move. She'd underestimated me, and now, she'd have to face the consequences. Days passed, and my focus shifted to Lily. If anything, this whole ordeal had only made me realize how much she needed me. Megan had left me blindsided, but Lily? She was innocent. None of this was her fault, and the thought of her being affected by Megan's recklessness made me sick. I arranged to meet my parents in the park where they'd been taking her on weekends, grateful they were nearby to help. When I arrived, Lily spotted me from a distance and came sprinting toward me, her little arms outstretched. I scooped her up, hugging her tightly, feeling a knot in my chest unwind a little. "Daddy, I missed you," she said, her eyes bright and joyful. "Why don't you come home?" And Mommy's acting strange. She's always on the phone, and she told me not to tell anyone about. She's friend Robert. Hearing Robert's name from her lips felt like another slap to the face, but I kept my expression calm, forcing a smile. I knelt down to her eye level, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. "Lily, you know I love you, right? And I'll always be here for you. But sometimes, moms and dads live in different places. It doesn't mean they love you any less." She nodded, her little face solemn. "Are you and Mommy, are you breaking up?" I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Yes, sweetheart. But no matter what, I'll always be your dad, and I'll always be here." Lily wrapped her arms around my neck, and we stayed like that, locked in a hug, until she finally whispered, "Promise." "I promise," I said, holding her tighter. I knew then that no matter what Megan tried to throw at me, I'd fight back for Lily's sake. But Megan wasn't finished. Barely a day passed before her threats began in earnest. At first, it was just petty manipulation, emails from her new lawyer, statements about how she was the real victim, claiming she'd make this as difficult as possible if I didn't agree to her terms. As if she were in any position to demand anything. I shared everything with Linda, who assured me this was standard. Then, as if to put a cherry on top of her campaign, I got a court summons one evening. Megan had filed for emergency custody, citing emotional instability on my part, claiming that I was an unfit father who'd abandoned her and Lily. She painted me as a threat, a man she'd feared and fled from. Linda called me that night, her voice tense but composed. "Jake, this isn't unusual, but it's crucial that we handle it carefully. The restraining order is her attempt to back up her claims, but we'll disprove it with evidence. The private investigator's findings will be critical here." The next morning, I met Dan, and he laid out a new file on the table in front of me. Inside were transcripts, emails, and detailed financial statements that showed just how entangled Megan and Robert had become. It was proof not just of their affair, but of a calculated pattern of behavior. There were emails discussing their future plans, making it clear that she'd intended to leave me for him all along, dragging Lily into their mess without a second thought. Dan looked at me, his expression serious. "Jake, with this, you'll have a strong case. This isn't just infidelity. It's fraud, and shows an unstable environment. The court will see that." That day, we filed our response to her emergency custody claim, attaching all the evidence Dan had gathered. Linda arranged for witness testimony from the building's security guard and one of Megan's colleagues, both willing to confirm that they'd seen Megan and Robert in compromising situations, that they'd known something was going on. The guard even agreed to testify about the night he'd seen me leave the office in shock. Finally, I was ready. I'd spent months living in Megan's twisted version of reality, but now, I was about to tear it down brick by brick. She thought she was untouchable, but she'd left a trail, one I was more than willing to follow, all the way to court. The day of the court hearing arrived, and I felt a strange mix of anticipation and dread. The courtroom was a world unto itself, a realm where lives hung in the balance, and the air was thick with tension. I'd prepared for this moment like a soldier gearing up for battle, but nothing could quite capture the reality of stepping into that sterile room filled with legal jargon and judgment. Megan arrived, looking polished and composed, as if she were attending a gala rather than facing the collapse of her carefully curated facade. Her hair was perfectly styled, and she wore a tailored suit that screamed, "I'm not guilty." I almost admired the effort she'd put into looking like the victim. Almost. As we settled into our respective corners, I could see her glancing nervously at her lawyer, who looked as though he had just eaten a lemon. Good. Let her sweat. This was my moment, and I wasn't going to let her manipulate the narrative any longer. Linda was by my side, exuding calm authority. "Just remember, Jake, stay focused on Lily. They'll try to twist everything, but you keep your eyes on the prize." When the judge entered, the room fell silent. She was a stern-looking woman with a reputation for no-nonsense rulings. I took a deep breath, reminding myself that I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore, I was fighting for my daughter. The proceedings began with Megan's lawyer outlining her case. He painted a picture of me as an unfit father, emphasizing my supposed emotional instability and framing Megan as the victim of my volatile behavior. Each word dripped with a calculated cruelty designed to twist the knife. "Your Honor," he concluded, "we request immediate temporary custody to ensure the child's well-being. Mr. Hayes has demonstrated a lack of stability and responsibility." I felt my blood boil. Here was a man willing to misrepresent the truth for the sake of a paycheck, and I was expected to sit there and take it? Linda stood up, unfazed. "Your Honor, I'd like to call Mr. Hayes to the stand." I rose, the room spinning slightly as I made my way to the witness stand. I could feel Megan's eyes boring into me, her facade cracking just enough to reveal the desperation underneath. I took a deep breath and focused on the judge. "Mr. Hayes, can you please recount your perspective on your relationship with your wife and the current circumstances regarding your daughter?" Linda asked. I steadied myself, my voice steady but tinged with the emotion I had held back for far too long. "Megan and I have been married for 6 years, and while things haven't been perfect, I've always prioritized Lily. But I've discovered that my wife has been engaging in an affair and hiding it from me, while simultaneously manipulating our lives and finances." The judge leaned in slightly, intrigued. "Can you elaborate on that?" I continued, detailing the evidence Dan had gathered, recounting the nights spent sleepless as I pieced together the lies. I mentioned the emails, the texts, the financial discrepancies, and finally, the toll it had taken on my relationship with Lily. "I've always been there for my daughter," I said, my voice growing firmer. "I want to provide her with a stable home, free from the chaos that my wife has created. She deserves that. As I finished, I could see the judge's expression shift slightly. Perhaps she was starting to see the cracks in Megan's story. Then, it was Megan's turn to take the stand. She walked up, all confidence and poise, but I noticed the tremor in her hands as she began to speak. The facade was slipping, and I could smell the fear wafting off her like cheap perfume. "Mr. Hayes has been erratic," she claimed, her voice shaking slightly. "He often left without notice, abandoning me and Lily. I had to protect myself." Linda interrupted smoothly. "Did you not have an affair with Robert Matthews during this time?" Megan's expression shifted to one of fury. "That's irrelevant. This is about my daughter's safety." Linda pressed on, undeterred. "Your Honor, I would like to submit evidence of the affair and the financial documents that prove Mr. Hayes has been the primary caregiver." The judge accepted the evidence without hesitation, flipping through the pages, her brow furrowing deeper as she absorbed the information. I could see Megan squirming in her seat, her carefully crafted narrative unraveling. The cross-examination continued, and the tension in the room escalated. Megan's lawyer tried to redirect the narrative, but Linda skillfully navigated each question, reinforcing the point that Megan's choices had jeopardized not just our marriage but Lily's future. "Your Honor," I finally interjected, my voice rising with conviction, "this isn't just about custody. This is about protecting my daughter from a toxic environment. Megan has made choices that have put her own interests above those of our child, and it's time to hold her accountable." As I spoke, I could see the judge nodding, her expression contemplative. I had come to realize that despite everything, I needed to stay focused on what truly mattered, Lily's safety and happiness. After what felt like an eternity, the judge adjourned the hearing, promising a decision would come soon. As I walked out of the courtroom, I felt a strange mix of relief and anticipation. I had done everything I could to expose the truth, but would it be enough? The following days were filled with an uneasy silence. I continued to take care of Lily, ensuring she felt safe and loved, even as I waited for the judge's decision. Each night, I replayed the courtroom scenes in my head, analyzing every moment. Had I been convincing enough? Had I pushed back hard enough against Megan's lies? Finally, the day arrived when I received a call from Linda, her tone serious. "Jake, the judge has made her ruling. Can you meet me at my office?" I arrived, my heart pounding, feeling as if I were about to walk into a battlefield once again. Linda's expression was grave as she gestured for me to sit. "Jake," she said, choosing her words carefully, "the judge ruled in your favor for temporary custody. Given the evidence, she believes it's in Lily's best interest to remain with you." Relief washed over me, but it was quickly overshadowed by the weight of what was to come. "What about Megan?" Linda sighed. "She has been granted visitation rights, but they will be monitored. The court is aware of her instability and the potential risk involved." I nodded, processing the information. This was a victory, but it felt more like a battle won in a war that was far from over. Megan wouldn't take this lightly. She would fight back, and I needed to be ready. "Thank you, Linda," I said, my voice steady. "I couldn't have done this without you." The relief of winning temporary custody was short-lived. Megan wouldn't let this go quietly. Just as Linda and I had anticipated, her response came fast and furious, escalating from veiled threats to outright manipulation. As soon as the court finalized my temporary custody, Megan switched tactics, trying to undermine me by any means necessary. Her first move was to appeal the custody ruling. She filed complaints claiming the decision was unfairly biased and that my influence had somehow skewed the court's perception. It was a desperate grasp for control, and Linda reassured me that it was a weak case. But this wasn't about logic or fairness for Megan. It was about dragging the fight out as long as possible, hoping to wear me down. Then came the barrage of messages. Since our last court appearance, Megan had flipped between sending remorseful texts begging for another chance and furious emails accusing me of ruining her life. It was exhausting. I'd hear from her attorney, then see a message from her apologizing for the way things had turned out, only for her to follow up with another email hours later calling me a selfish coward. And just as Linda had suspected, Megan decided to weaponize Lily in her vendetta. One morning, I received an official notice from her lawyer. Megan was requesting increased visitation rights, claiming that Lily's well-being would be jeopardized if she wasn't given more time with her daughter. Her lawyer argued that I was denying Megan the right to be a mother, and threatened that they'd seek full custody if I didn't comply. Linda was unfazed, but I was furious. "She's using Lily as a bargaining chip," I said, pacing in Linda's office. "She knows Lily's better off with me. This is all just a power play." Linda nodded, her gaze steely. "You're absolutely right, Jake. She's trying to create a record of parental alienation against you, hoping the court will see you as uncooperative. We won't let her win this. All we have to do is stay calm and let her expose herself. We'll respond to her every move." I clenched my fists, frustrated but determined. "Then let's take it a step further. Let's prove to the court that her behavior is what's actually harmful to Lily." Linda raised an eyebrow. "I like where this is going. If we can document this pattern of manipulation, we can argue for even stricter limitations on her visitation." The next court hearing came sooner than expected. This time, Linda presented Megan's erratic behavior as evidence of instability, showing her alternating emails of apology and accusation to demonstrate her unsteady state of mind. Then we submitted reports from Dan, our investigator, which detailed Megan's history of deceit, the attempts at financial manipulation, and her fabricated claims. Linda was relentless. "Your Honor, these emails show a clear pattern of manipulation. Ms. Hayes has made threats, used their daughter as leverage, and has not upheld her end of the temporary custody arrangement. Mr. Hayes has provided a stable, loving environment for Lily, and it's clear Ms. Hayes's actions are rooted in personal resentment, not genuine parental concern." Megan's lawyer tried to argue that Megan's messages were misinterpreted and a result of emotional distress. He painted her as a mother who had simply been pushed too far by an uncooperative husband. But the judge wasn't buying it. I could see her carefully reviewing the copies of Megan's increasingly erratic messages, her brow furrowing with each one. Finally, the judge leaned forward, her gaze directed at Megan. "Ms. Hayes, your correspondence shows a lack of respect for court orders and casts doubt on your judgment. I will not tolerate attempts to undermine the child's best interest with games of manipulation." She ordered that Megan's visitation rights remain limited and would now require additional supervision. Megan looked stunned, her face a mix of disbelief and fury. The courtroom had fallen silent, and for the first time, she seemed to realize just how deeply she'd undermined herself. In the days that followed, things got oddly quiet. Megan's threats and messages stopped abruptly, and the air felt thick with the anticipation of whatever she was planning next. I didn't trust this silence. Megan wasn't the type to back down quietly, and I knew another blow was coming. Then one afternoon, I found myself summoned to HR at work. I walked in, confused, and was greeted by the manager's sympathetic expression. "Jake," he said, sighing, "we received a formal complaint this morning. Apparently, it claims you've been inappropriate in the workplace." I blinked, caught off guard. "What? I've been nothing but professional. Who filed this?" He shrugged, looking uncomfortable. "It's anonymous, but you should know that we've had others like it recently, all suspiciously timed with your legal case. If I'm honest, Jake, it doesn't look good. We're going to need to conduct an investigation." Megan had crossed the line. She was now sabotaging my job, desperate to cut off my financial stability. I knew she had no proof. This was just another twisted scheme. But I felt a chill at the realization of how far she was willing to go. I called Linda that evening, barely able to contain my anger. "She's coming after my job now. She's putting everything on the line just to tear me down. How do we counter this?" Linda was silent for a moment before speaking. "Jake, I think it's time we bring all of this to light. Let's bring the court our complete documentation, the full history of her manipulations, the financial deceit, the harassment, and now this attempt to ruin your career. We need to present her to the court as a consistent pattern of instability and abuse." I nodded, ready to take the fight to the next level. "Let's go all the way, Linda. No more holding back." On the next court date, we submitted everything. Dan's final report had unearthed every dirty trick in Megan's playbook. The judge was presented with everything: Megan's erratic behavior, her attempts at parental alienation, the manipulation of Lily, the fabricated workplace accusations, and evidence of her ongoing affair with Robert, proving her complete disregard for family stability. Linda didn't mince words. Your Honor, Ms. Hayes's behavior demonstrates a clear attempt to destabilize Mr. Hayes's life and endanger Lily's well-being out of spite. We request full custody for Mr. Hayes and a restriction on Ms. Hayes's visitation, as she is unfit to provide a safe environment. Megan's lawyer scrambled to defend her, arguing that it was a highly emotional case and that she was merely a mother fighting for her child. But it was too late. The judge had seen too much. The evidence was damning, and Megan's actions had spoken louder than any excuse her lawyer could conjure. Finally, the judge delivered her ruling: full custody to me, with Megan's visitation rights reduced to supervised, infrequent visits until she could prove stability. I watched as Megan's face crumbled, the weight of her defeat sinking in. It was over. That night, I tucked Lily into bed, feeling a weight lifted from my shoulders for the first time in what felt like forever. I had fought for her, protected her from the chaos Megan had tried to unleash, and now we could finally look forward to a life where stability and peace were possible. As I stood by her bedroom door, watching her drift into sleep, I realized the depth of the battle I'd endured. It hadn't been just about winning custody. It was about protecting Lily's future, ensuring she'd grow up in a home filled with love, not lies. And as I closed her door, I felt a sense of closure. Megan had chosen her path, and she would face the consequences of her actions. But as for Lily and me, we'd build a new life, one free from the shadows of betrayal and manipulation. This chapter was finally, truly over. The future was ours to rebuild, and I intended to make it one worth living. A few months had passed since I'd won the court case, and as I returned home, the weight of the ordeal began to lift. The first thing I did was transform the space around me. I rearranged the furniture, opted for lighter colors, and opened the curtains to let in the sun. The incessant buzz of court battles had faded, all the papers were signed, and I was finally starting to breathe again. Ironically, getting laid off turned out to be a blessing in disguise. Before I could even update my LinkedIn profile, HP reached out with an enticing offer, better conditions and a chance to move forward. It felt surreal, as if life was nudging me in the right direction. Meanwhile, things weren't going so well for Megan and Robert. Rumor had it that Robert's wife had grown tired of his antics and filed for divorce, no longer willing to tolerate his reckless behavior. His indiscretions had caught up with him, and the fallout was brutal. Lawyers were circling like sharks, and now his money seemed to be working against him, and legal problems were mounting on all sides. As for Megan, she'd lost her job after the divorce. Word had spread quickly about her scandalous behavior, and no one was eager to hire someone who used their office for, let's say, less than professional pursuits. With nowhere to go, the last I heard she was desperately looking for any job, clinging to anything she could find. It was a sobering reminder of how quickly life could unravel. In just a few months, she'd lost everything. But then again, everyone makes their choices, and we all reap the consequences of those choices. Standing in the yard, I watched Lily play, her laughter filling the air. She dashed over, her face bright with curiosity. "Daddy, are you happy?" "Yes, dear," I replied, pulling her into a hug. "Because I have you." As I held her, I felt a sense of closure wash over me. That dark chapter of our lives was finally behind us. It was time to start anew, to write our own story filled with hope and possibility.